Ladies and gentlemen, you ever find yourself caught in a loop, overthinking, spiraling, questioning, doubting, wondering if you're doing the right thing? You lay in bed at night, your mind racing faster than you can keep up with, and you can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. You ask yourself, what if I'm making a mistake? What if this doesn't work out? What if I fail? It's like your mind is a prison, and overthinking is the warden, locking you in and telling you all the things you can't do, all the reasons you'll never make it. But here's the truth you need to hear today. Overthinking is killing your faith. I want you to stop for a moment and really think about this. What is faith? Faith is the ability to trust in what you can't see. Faith is moving forward even when the path ahead is unclear. Faith is saying, God, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I know you will. But how can you trust God with your future when you're busy worrying about every little detail? How can you believe He's got it all under control when you're trying to control everything yourself? Overthinking puts you in a place where your focus shifts from the God who is bigger than your problems to the problems that feel bigger than your God. We get so fixated on what might go wrong that we lose sight of what could go right. We look at our circumstances and let them speak louder than the promises of God. We forget that God has already gone ahead of us, that He's already prepared the way, that He has already set the plan in motion. And what happens when you're stuck in that cycle of doubt and fear? You start to paralyze yourself. You stop making decisions. You stop taking risks. You stop stepping out in faith. You get comfortable in your confusion, trapped in your own head. And you forget that faith is not about understanding every step of the journey. It's about moving forward in trust, even when the path isn't clear. So let me remind you of something today. Your faith will never grow in the comfort of your thought. Your faith grows when you step out, when you let go of the need to have everything figured out, when you allow God to be God and trust Him with what you can't control. Overthinking keeps you in the safe zone, but the safe zone is not where miracles happen. Miracles happen when you take God at His word, when you believe that He can do what you can't do, when you let go of the what ifs and say, God, I trust you anyway. The next time you find yourself trapped in that mental maze, ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? Is it that God might not come through? Or is it that you're afraid of letting go of control and trusting Him with what's out of your hands? Don't let fear rob you of your faith. Don't let overthinking convince you that you have to do it all on your own. Remember, you serve a God who is faithful, a God who has never failed you, and a God who is always working on your behalf, even when you can't see it. So stop overthinking and start trusting. Don't let your mind steal the peace that God wants to give you. The more you trust, the less you have to figure out. That's the kind of faith that moves mountains. That's the kind of faith that changes everything. Overthinking is like a mental prison, a place where we find ourselves trapped by our own thoughts. It creates an illusion of control, a false sense that if we just think hard enough, we'll be able to solve everything. But the truth is, overthinking doesn't bring clarity, it brings confusion. And in that confusion, our faith begins to suffer. When we focus too much on the what-ifs and the endless possibilities, we're allowing our minds to block the very thing that helps us move forward, trust in God. Think about the times when you've overthought a situation. Maybe it was a decision you had to make or a challenge you were facing. The more you analyzed it, the more paralyzed you became. Every scenario seemed possible, every outcome seemed uncertain, and every choice seemed to carry a heavy weight. And in that moment, it felt like you were in control. You thought, if I just think about this enough, I'll find the right answer. But that's not the way faith works. Overthinking is the enemy of faith because it makes you feel like you have to have all the answers in order to take a step. It convinces you that if you don't have every detail figured out, you can't move forward. But the reality is, faith doesn't need all the answers. When we overthink, we shift our focus away from the God who holds our future to the problems we think we can control. We forget that we were never meant to figure everything out on our own. God is the one who has the plan. He is the one who goes before us, who makes a way where there seems to be no way. But when we let our minds take over, we drown out His voice. We start to believe that it's all on us, that if we don't have a perfect plan, we'll fail. And in that place, we lose sight of the fact that God has already gone ahead of us, already prepared the way. What we're really doing when we overthink is trying to take control from God. We think that if we can just analyze every detail, we can somehow prevent mistakes or avoid failure. But that's not how faith works. Faith isn't about controlling everything. Faith is about surrender. It's about saying, God, I trust you with what I can't control, and I believe that you'll guide me in every step, even when I can't see the path clearly. The Bible talks about trusting God with all our heart and not leaning on our own understanding. Overthinking is leaning on our own understanding. It's trying to figure it all out on our own without allowing room for God's wisdom, peace, and direction. Proverbs 3:5 and 6 says, Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. The moment we start trying to figure everything out in our own strength, we begin to lose sight of the fact that God is the one who is guiding us. We need to stop overthinking and start trusting. When you overthink, you're asking questions that God has already answered. He has already given you His direction, His peace, and His promises. But overthinking clouds that. It distracts you from His voice. It makes you question His plan. And when you're consumed by doubts and fears, you're no longer walking by faith. You're walking by fear. If you've ever found yourself caught in the endless loop of overthinking, you know how exhausting it can be. It takes up so much energy and leaves you feeling drained, stuck, and unsure of your next step. But this is not how God intended us to live. He didn't call us to live in a constant state of mental turmoil. He called us to live by faith, to trust in His promises, and to move forward with the confidence that He is with us every step of the way. When you overthink, you're allowing fear and doubt to take the wheel. You're letting them dictate your decisions, your actions, and your outlook. But when you release control and trust in God, that's when you can truly experience the peace that surpasses understanding. That's when you can step into the future He has for you without being paralyzed by fear. So, the next time you find yourself caught in the trap of overthinking, remember that it's not your job to figure it all out. Your job is to trust God, to lean into His understanding, and to move forward in faith. Overthinking is killing your faith because it keeps you focused on what you can't control, instead of trusting in the one who is already in control. Let go of the mental struggle and allow God to lead you, knowing that His plan is greater than any doubt or fear that may try to hold you back. Faith is not about having all the answers or understanding every step of the journey. It's about trusting God, even when the way ahead seems unclear. We live in a world where we're taught that knowledge and understanding are everything, that if we don't have all the facts, we can't make informed decisions. But God doesn't call us to understand everything before we act. He calls us to trust Him. Trust isn't built on what we can see, but on what we believe, even when we can't see the full picture. The problem with overthinking is that it tries to make sense of things that were never meant to be fully understood. When we overthink, we try to control what is out of our hands, and we forget that faith is not about understanding the how and why of everything. It's about believing in the who, the one who has a purpose for our lives, the one who has been faithful in the past, and the one who will continue to be faithful in the future. Too often we approach our challenges with a mindset that says, I need to know all the details before I move forward. But faith doesn't work that way. God's ways are higher than our ways, and His understanding far surpasses ours. That means there will be moments in our lives when we can't possibly understand why things are happening the way they are. There will be times when the road ahead seems foggy, and we can't see how it will all work out. But that's the moment when God is asking us to trust Him, not because we understand. In the Bible, God often called His people to move without giving them all the details. Think of Abraham, who was told to leave everything behind and go to a land he had never seen, without knowing where he was going or how it would unfold. Abraham didn't have all the answers, but he trusted God, and that trust made all the difference. Faith is not about knowing everything in advance. It's about knowing that God's plans for us are good, even when we don't have the full picture. Faith requires us to step out even when the path isn't clear. If we were to wait for all the answers before we took action, we would never move. Overthinking keeps us stuck, paralyzed in fear and doubt, because we believe that our understanding is the key to success. But the truth is, God doesn't need us to have all the answers. He just needs us to trust Him enough to take the first step. When we act in faith, even in the absence of understanding, God will reveal the next. He doesn't need us to have it all figured out before we move. He needs us to trust Him as we move. Sometimes the uncertainty we face is exactly what God is using to strengthen our faith. When you overthink, you start to believe that your understanding is the key to your success. But faith teaches us that our understanding is not what will bring us through. It's God's wisdom, His timing, and His grace that will lead us to the right place. Faith is not about understanding the details. It's about trusting that God understands. It's about saying, God, I don't know how you're going to make this work, but I know you will. We don't need to have all the answers to move forward in faith. What we need is a heart that trusts in the one who holds the answers. Trusting God doesn't require us to have everything figured out. It requires us to believe that He does. And when we step out in faith, even when we don't understand, we begin to see God's hand at work. Faith isn't about waiting until everything makes sense. It's about moving forward, trusting that God is working even when we can't see the whole picture. Trust doesn't need all the answers. It needs belief in the one who has the answers. And when we trust Him, we allow God to lead us in ways we could never have planned or imagined on our own. That's the beauty of faith. It's not about understanding everything. It's about trusting the one who understands it all. Faith is often built in the most uncomfortable moments. It's easy to trust when things are going smoothly, when everything seems to be lining up the way we want. But the real test of faith comes when you're in the midst of uncertainty, when the future seems unclear, and when the path ahead is anything but smooth. Overthinking makes us want to hold on to the known, to stay in a place where we feel secure. But that place of comfort is exactly where our faith can't grow. True faith is not forged in comfort zones. It's built in the unknown, in the stepping out when everything around us is uncertain. Comfort is the enemy of growth. When we overthink, we try to find safety in knowing everything, in controlling every outcome. But that's not where faith thrives. Faith is about trust. Trust in God to lead us through the unknown. Trust that He will provide even when we can't see the provision. Trust that He will guide us even when we don't have a roadmap. The moment we step outside of our comfort zone, that's when we have no choice but to trust God. Think about a time when you stepped out in faith. Maybe you started a new job, moved to a new place, or faced a new challenge. If you were honest with yourself, you probably didn't have all the answers. You didn't know how it would all unfold, and you didn't know exactly what the outcome would be, but you took a step anyway. That's where faith is tested and strengthened. Faith is not about having everything figured out. It's about trusting God enough to take the first step, even when the path ahead isn't clear. When we stay in our comfort zones, we rely on our own understanding and our own plans. We're not giving God the chance to work in ways that go beyond our expectations. Comfort zones limit our ability to see the bigger picture. God doesn't want us to stay in a place of safety where we never experience the fullness of His power. He wants us to trust Him enough to move beyond what we can see, to step into the unknown, and to experience Him in ways that will transform us. Overthinking holds us back because it tells us we need to know everything before we act. But faith calls us to move before we have all the answers. Think about how many times in the Bible God called people to take steps of faith without giving them every detail. He called Abraham to leave his homeland, not knowing where he was going. He called Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, not knowing how it would all play out. He called Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water, not knowing if the waves would hold him up. In each of those situations, God didn't give them a full plan. He simply asked them to trust Him. And it was in those moments of uncertainty that their faith grew the most. When we take that step of faith, we move from a place of self-reliance to a place of God-reliance. We acknowledge that we can't do it on our own, that we don't have all the answers, but we trust that God does. Stepping out of our comfort zone requires courage, but it also requires humility. It's a declaration that we can't control everything, that we need God's help, and that we're willing to trust Him with what's beyond our understanding. Faith grows in the unknown because that's where we encounter God in ways we never would in the comfort of our own plans. It's in those moments of stepping out into the unknown that we see God's faithfulness in action. When everything around us is uncertain, it's the perfect opportunity for God to show us how He can provide, guide, and sustain us. But we will never experience that unless we are willing to leave our comfort zones behind and trust Him with what we cannot see. So, don't let overthinking hold you back from stepping into the unknown. Don't allow the fear of uncertainty to keep you stuck in a place where your faith can't grow. God is calling you to trust Him enough to move beyond your comfort zone, to step out into what feels uncomfortable, and to watch Him work in ways you never imagined. The growth of your faith depends on your willingness to step out, to trust Him with the unknown, and to allow Him to lead you into places you never thought possible. When we overthink, we start to lose perspective on what really matters. Overthinking shifts our focus away from God's promises and brings our attention to the problems that seem larger than life. We begin to magnify our circumstances, giving them more power than they actually have. The reality is, problems are only as big as we allow them to be in our minds. When we focus on them for too long, they begin to speak louder than the truth of who God is and what He has already done for us. We forget that we serve a God who is bigger than any problem we might face. Overthinking keeps us stuck in the details, obsessing over all the things that could go wrong, instead of remembering that God is already working in our lives, even when we can't see it. When we focus on the problems, we forget to focus on the solution. And that solution isn't found in our own abilities to fix things or to figure everything out. It's found in trusting God to lead us through the storms, to provide for us, and to bring us to a place of peace. When we're consumed by overthinking, it becomes hard to hear God's voice clearly. We get so caught up in the noise of our worries, doubts, and fears that we can't hear the still, small voice of God telling us to trust Him. We can't hear the truth that He is with us, that He has already gone before us, and that He will never leave us. We start to believe the lies that tell us that God has abandoned us, or that we are on our own. But God is always with us. He's always working on our behalf. He's always making a way, even when we can't see how. Overthinking turns our attention inward, making everything about us and our ability to control our circumstances. But faith isn't about focusing on our ability. It's about focusing on God's ability. Faith is not about looking at the mountain in front of us and trying to figure out how we're going to climb it on our own. Faith is about looking at the mountain and knowing that God is bigger than the mountain. Faith is about trusting that the God who made the mountain is the same God who will lead us through it, step by step. The more we focus on our problems, the less we focus on God's promises. We begin to lose sight of the truth that God is faithful, that He is good, and that He will never let us down. Our faith is meant to be in God, not in our ability to figure everything out or control every situation. When we start to overthink, we start to believe that the outcome depends on us. We forget that God is the one who holds the future, and He is the one who will bring us through. Think about the story of Peter walking on water. When he took his eyes off of Jesus and looked at the wind and the waves, he started to sink. The moment his focus shifted from Jesus to the storm, fear and doubt took over. But when he focused back on Jesus, he was able to walk on water again. Overthinking does the same thing in our lives. It shifts our focus from God to the problems, and in doing so, it makes the problems seem bigger than they really are. When we focus on God, the problems begin to shrink in comparison to His power. Overthinking can cause us to lose perspective on the fact that God is always in control. We forget that nothing happens outside of His will, and that He is working all things together for our good. The Bible reminds us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. We may not understand how everything is going to work out, but we can trust that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail to bring about something good in our lives. So when we find ourselves overwhelmed with thoughts and anxieties, we have to redirect our focus. We have to remember that our problems are not bigger than God's promises. We have to stop magnifying the challenges and start magnifying the one who can overcome every challenge. Faith doesn't deny the reality of the problems we face. It just chooses to focus on God's power, provision, and presence instead. When we keep our eyes on Him, we can walk through the storm with confidence, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. The next time you find yourself trapped in the cycle of overthinking, remind yourself of this truth. Your God is bigger than any problem you will ever face. The problems may feel overwhelming, but they are not greater than the power of the one who holds the universe in His hands. Shift your focus back to God, and let His promises remind you that He is with you, He is for you, and He is bigger than anything that tries to steal your peace. Faith is not about holding on to control, but about surrendering control to God. Overthinking feeds our need for control, making us believe that if we could just manage every detail, we would feel secure. But the truth is, the more we try to control, the more we are bound by the very things that cause anxiety and stress. We start to believe that everything depends on us, that we are the ones who have to ensure the outcome, when in reality, our job is to trust God with what is beyond our ability to manage. When we overthink, we tend to hold on to situations and outcomes like they are in our hands, trying to manipulate and direct them according to our own understanding. This desire for control stems from a fear of the unknown, a fear that if we don't manage every aspect of our lives, something could go wrong. We fear failure, rejection, or disappointment, and so we become fixated on controlling every situation. But God never asked us to hold all the pieces. He asked us to trust Him with the pieces, to surrender our need to control and allow Him to do the work that only He can do. This surrender is where true faith begins. Faith grows when we recognize that we cannot control every outcome, that we don't have the answers, and that there is so much in life that is simply beyond our understanding. Surrender doesn't mean giving up or giving in to helplessness. It means choosing to let go of the burden of control and choosing to trust that God knows what He is doing. It's choosing to believe that His plan is better than our own, even when we can't see the whole picture. Letting go of control is not always easy. We live in a world where we are constantly told to be in control, to have a plan, and to make things happen. We are praised for being organized, prepared, and proactive. And while planning and preparation are important, they should never replace our trust in God. The danger comes when we start to believe that if we don't have everything planned, if we don't manage every detail, things will fall apart. That's when overthinking sets in, and we find ourselves trapped in a cycle of worry, doubt, and fear. The truth is, we were never meant to carry that burden alone. God designed us to depend on Him, to lean on His understanding, and to trust His timing. Isaiah 55:8 9 reminds us that God's ways and thoughts are higher than ours. His perspective is so much greater, and His wisdom is beyond what we can comprehend. We can try to figure everything out on our own, but the reality is God has already gone ahead of us. He knows what we need, and He knows the way to get there. Our job is to trust Him with the path, even when we can't see it clearly. When we let go of the need for control, we are making space for God to work in ways we never imagined. Control limits what God can do in our lives because it keeps us focused on our own strength. But when we surrender, we allow God to step in and do what only He can do. This surrender doesn't mean passivity. It means active trust. It means saying, God, I don't have it all figured out, but I trust that you do. It means stepping into the unknown without the need for guarantees, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. This trust is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. We have to continually choose to surrender and remind ourselves that God is trustworthy. We have to learn to release our grip on the situations we can't control and place them in His hands. And when we do, we find peace that surpasses understanding. Philippians 4:6 tells us not to be anxious about anything, but to bring everything to God in prayer. When we surrender our anxieties and trust Him, the peace of God guards our hearts and minds. It's easy to let fear drive us into overthinking, convincing us that we need to control everything in order to avoid failure or disappointment. But the more we hold on to that control, the more we allow fear and anxiety to rule our hearts. Surrender frees us from that fear. It reminds us that we don't have to have all the answers, and we don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. God is in control, and He is faithful to lead us in the right direction. Letting go of control is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of trust and strength. It takes strength to acknowledge that we cannot do everything on our own, and it takes courage to release our fears into God's hands. When we surrender control, we are acknowledging that we are not the ones who hold the future. We are trusting that God will lead us, guide us, and provide for us in ways that are far beyond what we can imagine. So the next time you find yourself overthinking and trying to control every situation, remember that God is already at work. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just have to trust Him. Let go of the burden of control. Surrender it to Him and watch as He leads you through the unknown. Faith grows in surrender, and when you trust God with your life, He will guide you in ways that you never could have done on your own. In the end, overthinking is simply a distraction from the power of faith. It pulls our focus away from the God who holds our future and makes us believe that we can control things that are ultimately beyond us. But faith isn't about having all the answers or understanding every twist and turn ahead. It's about trusting that the God who created the universe is fully capable of guiding us through whatever comes our way. When we stop overthinking, we stop limiting God's ability to work in our lives. We step into a space where He can move, where His promises can unfold, and where His peace can settle our hearts. So remember, faith is not about understanding the how. It's about trusting in the who. The God who has been faithful in the past is the same God who will lead us into the future. Our job is to trust Him, to let go of the need to control, and to have the courage to move forward even when the path ahead isn't clear. The more we surrender, the more we allow God to take over and lead us in ways that exceed our expectations. Faith doesn't require us to have all the answers. It just asks us to take the first step, trusting that God will guide us each step of the way. Overthinking will only paralyze us, but faith frees us, giving us the courage to walk into the unknown with confidence, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. So today, choose to trust. Choose to step out in faith. Choose to believe that even when you don't have all the answers, God has already prepared the way.